Most people spend their entire lives chasing happiness. They treat it like a destination, a reward, a finish line waiting somewhere in the future. If I earn more, I'll be happy. If I find the right person, I'll be happy. If life finally gets easier, I'll be happy. But what if that belief is the biggest illusion you've ever been sold? Because happiness is fragile. It depends on conditions, comfort, control. And the moment those conditions disappear, so does your sense of purpose. Now imagine a world where comfort doesn't exist. No safety, no privacy, no certainty that you'll even survive the next day. Imagine being stripped of your name, your family, your past, your future. Not metaphorically. Literally, you are no longer a person. You are a number. This was the reality inside the concentration camps. A place where hope was not encouraged. It was dangerous. A place where survival wasn't about strength. It was about meaning. Because in that frozen, brutal environment, something unexpected happened. The people who survived were not always the strongest, not the smartest, not the most physically capable. They were the ones who had a reason to endure the cold, a reason to endure the hunger, a reason to wake up, even when every part of their body begged them not to. And at the center of this observation was a man named Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist, a prisoner, a witness to the collapse of human identity. He watched people break, not physically, psychologically. He saw men who had everything taken from them lose the will to live, long before their bodies gave out. And he saw others who had nothing left somehow keep going. Not because they were hopeful, not because they believed things would get better, but because they found something deeper than hope. Meaning, this is where everything changes. Because happiness asks one question, what do I want from life? But meaning asks a different question, what does life expect from me right now? And that question doesn't disappear when things get hard, it becomes more important. Frankl realized something terrifying. When you base your life on happiness, you are completely unprepared for suffering. And suffering is not optional. At some point life will take something from you. Control, certainty, someone you love. And in that moment, happiness will not save you, because happiness cannot exist in chaos. But meaning can. Meaning can exist in pain, in loss, in uncertainty. Meaning doesn't wait for conditions to improve. It adapts. And that is what makes it powerful. Inside the camps, there was no room for illusions, no room for things will get better, no room for this will pass. Only one question remained, why should I keep going when everything is gone? And the people who could answer that survived, not because they escaped suffering, but because they endured it with purpose. This is the truth most people avoid. You don't find meaning when life is easy. You discover it when life gives you no other choice. And that's exactly where we are going. Because to understand meaning, you have to understand what happens when everything else is stripped away. When choice disappears. When comfort disappears. When identity disappears. And all that's left is you. Next, we step into that reality, where the illusion of control breaks, and the real test of human existence begins. The sovereign soul reclaimed. After everything is taken, after identity is stripped, after suffering becomes unavoidable, something remains. Not strength in the physical sense, not control over your environment, not certainty about the future, something quieter, more absolute, your ability to choose how you respond. Viktor Frankl called this the last of human freedoms, not a poetic idea, a reality tested under the harshest conditions imaginable. Because when nothing else belongs to you, this still does. You cannot choose your pain. You cannot choose your circumstances. You cannot choose what life takes from you. But you can choose your stance. And that stance defines everything. It defines whether suffering destroys you or refines you. Whether you collapse under pressure or carry it with purpose. Whether you become bitter or become deeper. This is where sovereignty begins, not in controlling life, in mastering your response to it, because control over life is fragile. It can be taken in an instant, but control over yourself is something you build, and once it's built, it cannot be removed by force. This is what separates survival from transcendence. Survival is enduring what happens. Transcendence is deciding what it means. Most people wait. They wait for better conditions, better timing, better circumstances. I'll start living when things improve. I'll find purpose when life makes sense. I'll act when I feel ready. But that moment never arrives, because life does not pause for your readiness. It continues, with or without your participation. And the longer you wait, the more you drift. This is the final trap, believing that purpose is something you step into later, when in reality, it is something you decide now, in this moment, in your current condition, with everything that is imperfect, uncertain, and incomplete. Frankl's lesson is not about surviving a camp. It's about understanding that you don't need extreme suffering to access this level of control. You already have it. Every time something goes wrong, every time something feels unfair, every time life doesn't go the way you expected, you are given a choice. React automatically or respond intentionally. Blame circumstances or assign meaning. Wait passively or act with purpose. These choices seem small, but they compound. Over time, they shape who you become. A person who is controlled by life, or a person who directs themselves through it. This is what it means to reclaim your soul, not in a mystical sense. In a practical one, you stop being defined by what happens to you. You start being defined by how you handle it. And that shift is absolute. Because once you realize that your response is always yours, you stop feeling powerless. Even in difficult situations, even in uncertainty, even in loss. You may not control the event, but you control your stance. And that stance becomes your identity, not your job, not your status, not your circumstances, your response. This is where real freedom exists, not in comfort, not in ease, in responsibility. The responsibility to choose who you are in every situation. And that responsibility is heavy, because it removes every excuse. You can't say, I had no choice, because you always do. Maybe not in what happens, but in how you meet it. And once you accept that, something changes. You stop waiting. You stop negotiating with life. You stop hoping things will align perfectly. You start acting with purpose, with clarity, with intent, not because conditions are ideal, but because you've decided they don't need to be. This is the final transformation. From someone searching for meaning to someone creating it. From someone reacting to life to someone responding to it. From someone dependent on circumstances to someone sovereign within them. And once you reach that point, life no longer dictates your worth. You do. Because your value is no longer measured by what you receive, but by how you carry what you are given. That is the highest form of freedom. And once you understand it, you are no longer waiting to live. You are already doing it, right now, with everything you have, exactly where you are. Logotherapy as a weapon of defiance. When everything is taken from you, you are left with one terrifying realization. No one is coming. No rescue, no sudden reversal. No moment where life apologizes and gives everything back. And in that silence, you are forced to answer a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What is the point of continuing when nothing is guaranteed? Most people wait for meaning to appear. They think it will come from success, from love, from recognition. But inside the camp there was no waiting. If you didn't create meaning, you lost it. And if you lost it, you didn't survive. This is where Frankl's philosophy becomes something more than an idea. It becomes a weapon. He called it logotherapy, not therapy in the comforting sense, not healing in the traditional sense. A deliberate act of choosing meaning, even when there is no evidence that it exists. Especially then, because meaning is not something you find in your circumstances. It is something you assign to them. That's the difference. You are not waiting for life to give you purpose. You are deciding what your suffering will mean, and that decision is the most powerful form of resistance. Frankl didn't survive because he was hopeful. He survived because he gave himself a reason to endure. In the middle of starvation, exhaustion, dehumanization, he would imagine himself in the future, standing in front of an audience, teaching them everything he had learned. Not as a fantasy, as a commitment. He turned his suffering into material, into knowledge, into something that would outlive the pain. And that changed everything, because now his suffering was no longer pointless. It had a function. It became something he was carrying, not something that was crushing him. This is the core of logotherapy. You take something that seems meaningless and you give it meaning. Not randomly. Intentionally, you decide, this pain is building something. This struggle is shaping something. This experience will become something. And once you decide that, your relationship to suffering changes. It doesn't disappear, but it transforms, because now you are not just enduring, you are using it. Frankl identified 3 primary ways humans create meaning. Through work, through love. Through suffering, work gives you something to build. Love gives you something to care about. But suffering gives you something to prove. Not to the world, to yourself. That you can endure, that you can carry weight. That you can remain human in inhuman conditions. This is where meaning becomes defiance. Because when everything is designed to break you, choosing to stand is rebellion. Choosing to care is rebellion. Choosing to assign purpose is rebellion. And that rebellion keeps you alive. The most dangerous moment in the camp was not physical exhaustion. It was psychological surrender. The moment someone decided, this is meaningless. Because once that belief takes hold, there is no reason to resist, no reason to try, no reason to continue, and without resistance, the system wins. Not by force, but by collapse. Logotherapy fights this directly. It forces you to create a why, not a vague idea, a specific reason. Someone you want to see again, something you need to finish, a version of yourself you refuse to abandon. And that why becomes your anchor. Because when the why is strong enough, the how becomes irrelevant. Pain becomes tolerable. Uncertainty becomes manageable. Time becomes secondary. You stop asking, how long will this last? And start asking, what must I do while I'm here? That shift is everything, because it moves you from passive suffering to active endurance. You are no longer a victim of your circumstances. You are a participant in them, and that participation creates meaning, even in the darkest conditions. This is the lesson most people miss. You don't need perfect conditions to find purpose. You need a decision to assign value where none seems to exist. And once you make that decision, you are no longer helpless. You are dangerous, because you cannot be broken by circumstances alone. Next, we go even deeper, because understanding how to create meaning is only part of the equation. The real transformation happens when you realize something even more radical, that suffering itself can become a form of achievement, not something to avoid, but something to transform. And that idea changes everything. The vacuum of purpose at first, the body resists. It fights, it adapts, it clings to survival with everything it has. But the body is not the first thing to break. The mind is. Not in a dramatic way, not in a sudden collapse. In a quiet, almost invisible surrender. It begins the moment a person realizes there is nothing left to return to. No career waiting, no identity to reclaim, no certainty that loved ones are even alive. Everything that once defined who you are is gone. And when that happens, a strange emptiness takes its place. Frankl called it the existential vacuum. Not pain, not fear. Absence, a hollow space where meaning used to exist. Because most people don't build their sense of purpose internally. They borrow it from their job, their relationships, their status, their goals. And as long as those things are intact, they feel grounded. But remove all of them at once, and something terrifying happens. There is nothing left to hold on to. You are still alive, but you don't know why, and that question becomes unbearable. Why continue when there is nothing waiting? Frankl saw this pattern over and over again. Prisoners who had lived for external goals collapsed the fastest. The ones who said, "I just need to survive until I see my family again. I just need to make it through this, then everything will be okay." Because when that belief cracked, when doubt entered, their entire reason to endure disappeared. And without a reason, the body follows. Not immediately, but inevitably, they would stop caring, stop resisting, stop trying, and in a place where survival required constant effort, that was enough. But then there were others. People who had nothing, no certainty, no guarantees, no future they could clearly see. And yet, they kept going, not because they were hopeful, but because they shifted the question. They stopped asking, "What will I get from life?" and started asking, "What does life expect from me right now?" That shift changes everything, because when you expect something from life, you are dependent on outcomes. And in the camp, outcomes were unpredictable. But when life expects something from you, you become responsible. And responsibility creates direction, even in chaos. Frankl described people who found purpose in the smallest things. One man held onto the idea of seeing his wife again, even though he had no proof she was alive. Another focused on finishing a piece of work, a manuscript that had been taken from him. Some found purpose in simply helping others survive, sharing a piece of bread, offering a word of encouragement. These weren't grand goals, they weren't guaranteed, but they were enough. Because meaning doesn't need certainty, it needs intention. And intention gives the mind something to anchor to. Without that anchor, you drift. You wake up, but there's no reason to move. You breathe, but there's no reason to endure. And slowly, you begin to disappear. This is the danger of the vacuum, not that you feel pain, but that you stop feeling anything at all. Because when nothing matters, everything becomes heavy, even survival. Frankl understood this deeply. He realized that humans are not driven primarily by pleasure or power, but by meaning. Take away pleasure, they can endure. Take away comfort, they can adapt. But take away meaning, and they collapse. This is the hidden truth most people never confront. You are not as strong as you think. Not because you lack ability, but because your strength is tied to your sense of purpose. And if that purpose is fragile, so are you. The modern world hides this from you. It distracts you, entertains you, keeps you busy so you never have to face the question, why am I doing any of this? But the moment life forces that question, you either find an answer or you fall into the vacuum. This is where Frankl's philosophy begins to take shape, because meaning is not something you wait to discover. It is something you create, deliberately, even when everything feels meaningless, especially then. Next, we move from understanding the problem to building the solution, because once you realize that meaning is the only thing keeping you alive, you have to learn how to forge it. Not theoretically, practically, in a place where everything is designed to break you. And that is where Frankl's greatest insight emerges. Meaning, as an act, the luxury of choice ends. You wake up, and for a brief second, your mind tries to lie to you. It tells you this is temporary, that this is a mistake, that someone will come and fix this. Frankl called this the delusion of reprieve, the quiet belief that you will be the exception, that somehow out of everyone here, you will be spared. And that belief feels comforting for a moment, but then reality arrives, not gently, violently. The cold doesn't care about your hope. The gods don't care about your past. The system doesn't care about your identity. You are no longer negotiating with life. You are at its mercy. In your world today, you are surrounded by choice. What to eat, what to wear, what to believe, what path to take. And because you have so many options, you believe you are in control. But inside the camp, that choice disappears. Not gradually, instantly. You don't choose when to wake up. You don't choose when to eat. You don't choose how long you work. You don't choose how you are treated. Even your body is no longer yours. It is used, exhausted, pushed beyond its limits. And when every external freedom is stripped, away something unsettling happens. You realize how much of your identity was built on things you could control. Your routine, your status, your possessions, your plans, all gone. And without them, you are forced to confront something most people never face. Who are you without your choices? Because choice creates the illusion of self. You think you are disciplined because you choose to work. You think you are kind because you choose to help. You think you are strong because you choose to endure. But what happens when you can't choose any of that? When discipline is forced? When suffering is constant? When endurance is no longer optional? That's when the illusion breaks. Frankl observed this closely. The moment prisoners realized that nothing external was coming to save them, many collapsed internally. Not because they were weak, but because their entire sense of control was gone. They were waiting for release, waiting for rescue, waiting for a future that might never come. And that waiting destroyed them, because waiting is passive. It assumes that life will eventually give you what you need. But in the camp, life demanded something from you instead. And the moment you stopped waiting, everything changed. Because even in a place where you have no control, there is still one thing left. Your internal world, your thoughts, your interpretations, your response. That is the final territory, and it cannot be taken from you unless you give it away. This is the shift Frankl discovered. When external freedom ends, internal freedom begins to matter. Not as a concept, as survival. You may not control your environment, but you can control how you see it. You may not control what happens to you, but you can control what it means to you. And that difference is everything. Because meaning is not found in what you are given. It is created in how you respond. Some prisoners saw only suffering, only loss, only despair, and slowly they stopped resisting. Others, in the same conditions, found something else. A reason to endure, a memory to hold onto, a future task to complete, not because their situation was better, but because their perspective was different. This is where the real power begins, not in changing your circumstances, but in changing your relationship to them. The modern world has trained you to believe that you need the right conditions to function. Comfort, stability, control. But Frankl's experience proves the opposite. When all of that is gone, you are not left with nothing. You are left with the most important thing, the ability to choose your attitude. And that choice is more powerful than any external freedom, because it cannot be taken, but it can be lost. The moment you give in to despair, the moment you stop assigning meaning, the moment you decide that nothing matters, that is when you truly lose control, not when your environment changes, but when your inner world collapses. This is the first lesson. You are not as free as you think. Your freedom depends on your conditions, your comfort, your options. But real freedom is something else entirely. It is the ability to remain internally stable even when everything external falls apart. And that kind of freedom is forged, not in comfort, in suffering. Next, we go deeper, because losing external control is only the beginning. The real danger comes after, when you lose something even more important than freedom, your sense of purpose. And without that, survival itself, where escape is no longer an option. No strategy left, no path out, no way to negotiate with reality. Just suffering, pure, unavoidable, relentless. Most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid this state. They build comfort, they chase stability. They design their lives to reduce pain as much as possible. And it works until it doesn't. Because there are moments in life where suffering is not optional. Loss that cannot be reversed. Illness that cannot be cured. Situations that cannot be escaped. And in those moments, everything you believed about life is tested. Because if your entire philosophy is built on avoiding pain, you collapse the moment pain becomes permanent. Frankl saw this clearly. He realized that suffering by itself is neutral. It doesn't carry meaning. It doesn't justify itself. It simply exists. What gives it weight is how you respond to it. Most people see suffering as a tragedy, something unfair, something meaningless, something that should never have happened. And that perspective is understandable, but it creates a problem. If suffering is meaningless, then enduring it is meaningless too. And if enduring it is meaningless, there is no reason to continue. This is where Frankl introduces something radical, the idea that suffering can be transformed, not removed, not avoided, transformed into something that has value. This is what he called tragic optimism, not blind positivity, not pretending everything is okay, but the ability to find meaning even in tragedy, even in pain, even in guilt, even in the certainty of death. Because those are the three unavoidable aspects of existence. Pain is inevitable, guilt is unavoidable, death is certain. You cannot eliminate them, but you can decide what they mean. This is where suffering becomes something else entirely. Not a punishment, a test, not a burden, a responsibility. Because the way you carry your suffering becomes a statement about who you are. Frankl observed prisoners who, despite everything, chose to remain compassionate. They shared their food, they helped others stand. They refused to become cruel, even when cruelty surrounded them. Not because it made their situation better, but because it preserved something inside them, their humanity, and that preservation became their achievement, not survival alone. Integrity, because when everything is taken from you, the only thing left to prove is who you choose to be. This is where suffering becomes meaningful, not because it feels good, but because it gives you an opportunity to respond with strength, with dignity, with purpose. And that response is entirely yours. No one can force it. No one can take it. It is the last space where you are completely free. Think about that. In a place designed to strip away every form of freedom, there is still one thing that remains untouched: your response. And in that response, your identity is rebuilt. Not based on comfort, not based on success, but based on choice. The choice to endure, the choice to remain human, the choice to assign meaning even when everything feels meaningless. This is what transforms suffering into a moral achievement, not the pain itself, but the way it is carried. Most people will never face the extremes of a concentration camp, but suffering still finds them, in different forms, different intensities: grief, failure, loss, isolation. And in those moments, the same question appears: why continue? If you cannot answer that, suffering becomes destructive, but if you can, it becomes transformative. Because now you are not just experiencing pain, you are shaping yourself through it. This is the bridge between past and present. Frankl's observations are not limited to history. They apply now, to every moment where life becomes difficult, because the conditions change, but the principle remains. You cannot always control what happens, but you can always control what it means. And that meaning determines whether you break or become something stronger. Next, we bring everything together, because after all the suffering, after all the loss, after all the transformation, one final truth remains. The one freedom that can never be taken from you. And once you understand it, you are no longer at the mercy of life. You become sovereign.